we recently did a couple episodes on buying an airplane, whether individually or in a co-ownership or even in a flying club. And we not too long ago did an episode on pre-buy inspections. And
Yes.
we've both done that. Both we've bought with and without pre-buys. But part of that pre-buy is looking at the logbooks, plural, because I think a lot of people don't realize while a pilot has one logbook until they build up enough hours they need a second, the airplane's got at least three. What
That's right.
what am I looking at when I pull out a logbook? If I'm looking at buying an airplane, what is it I'm hoping to find?
Well, first of all, logbooks, assuming they're complete and assuming that they're honest, logbooks can tell a great story. They really can. Um, I think a lot of people make a mistake of starting at the first page and working backward, or well, the earliest page. If you bought an airplane that's bought in 1960, they're starting in 1960 and working forward. That's the wrong way to do it. Start at the most recent entry and work your way backwards. But I would be looking certainly over the last probably 5 or 6 years pretty intently on things like damage history. Um, I'd be looking hard at the AD list to make sure that any ADs that especially
Airworthiness directives. Just to be
airworthiness.
clear, airworthiness directives where the FAA says this is a known issue with this type.
Yeah, and you will fix it, or you shall fix it if you really want to. Yeah, airworthiness directives (ADs). I want to look at the AD list, and not just a list of the stuff that the FAA has on their website, but I'm talking about a compliance list, one that actually the mechanic is signed off on and says, yes, this is done, and the next one is due whenever, if it's a recurring airworthiness directive. I mean, that's one thing. I want to look at the engine log. I want to see. For example, and we were talking about this before you hit the record button. Let's say that, in fact, I'll give you a real world example. A good friend of mine was starting a flying club up in Conroe, which is a little bit north of where I am. And they found a Grumman Tiger, fell in love with it. It had something like 300 hours on the engine. Well, the engine was overhauled in something like 1981 or something like that. So 300 hours in 40 years of flying.
Yeah,
And
that's probably not good.
yeah, and the broker said, I pull it out of the hangar every couple of months and I start it up and I run it for 30 minutes or so just to keep the oil circulating. And these guys were, man, this is a low time engine, and on and on and on and on and on. And I said, wait a minute, let's take a look at this a little bit deeper. So they sent me a copy of the logbooks, and I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but that 300 hours, the bulk of that 300 hours was put on something like the first 20 years, and not very many hours in the subsequent 20 years. So yes, it didn't have many hours on it, but oh my goodness, I suspect if you opened it up and looked inside, there's probably corrosion. Who knows what horrible things you can find. And on the other end of the spectrum, I have a friend that wanted to buy an airplane, happened to be a Comanche, and I knew of one that was available on the field where I have my airplane. Um, I put him in touch, and he called me back and said, I'm not going to buy that airplane because it's got 1,700 hours on the engine. Okay, it's a 2,000-hour Lycoming engine, 1,700 hours. He only flies 50 hours or so a year, and assuming the engine goes to to TBO, he's got several years of flying on that airplane before he's got the expense. But I understand. I said, well, how many years did it take them to put that 1,700 hours on there? Oh, 3 or 4. They fly it a lot. And I told him, Joe, I'll call him Joe, that engine is probably incredibly healthy because it's flown a lot. Now, if that 1,700 hours again had been over 40 years, maybe the calculations are a little different. But the point is, to an engine that is a high time engine that's flown a lot is probably healthier than that 300-hour engine that was in there for 40 years.
That's a really great point, and I don't think a lot of people think of that. They look at total time, and they don't think of what period of time did that total time happen in.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about logbooks, and I mentioned there's three. There's one for the airframe, there's one for the power plant, and there's one for the propeller.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal because you can have an airworthiness directive on any part of the airframe. For instance, wing spars.
Yeah.
That's a big one. There's a few aircraft out there that it's an issue. Or like the old Piper Tomahawk actually has some life limited parts. There's a point at which you can't fly it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Knowing that is really valuable because you might see a great price on an airplane and you go look at that logbook, and as you say, oh, it's only got 500 hours on the engine, it's flown a lot, but the airframe is just about used up.
Yeah,
And
you mentioned recurring ADs. The Cardinal has a big one. It's a one-time deal, but it's a big one on the wing spar. So does the Cessna 210, the Centurion.
mm-hmm,
The Comanche has one on the rear stabulator control unit. I've forgotten what it's called, but the one that makes the elevator go up and down.
mm-hmm.
Some of the older Cessnas have a recurring AD every 100 hours or every annual for the seat rails, because some of those older Cessnas had a tendency to let go
Yes, they did.
during takeoff. So, another thing that I'm looking at, and this is specific to the airframe logbook, is I'm looking to see when was the last annual done. And let's just say that it's within annual right now. Okay, well, when was it done?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not stopping there. I'm going back and looking, when was the previous annual done? Now I'm going to look at when the previous annual to that was done and see, is there any time in which that airplane was out of annual for some reason? And I'm also going to be looking at the amount of hours that were put on the airframe between when these various annuals were done. Did this airplane get annualed and then sit and fly 5 hours? That's probably not good for the year, 5 hours for
Mm-hmm.
the year. Or did it get annual? Then did it fly 500 hours? But on the next annual, it didn't fly for 5 or 10 hours. I'm just as interested in, was the airplane flown regularly, as I am in the number of hours that are on the airframe or the engine or the propeller or any other piece of equipment on that airplane.
We talk about TBO, time between overhaul. And first of
Right.
all, if you're just using the airplane yourself privately, TBO is a suggestion. You can go over it. If the engine's not burning oil and it's still got good compression, you're allowed to keep flying it.
Yep.
But one component that people often miss, and this can be a surprise expense, even a fixed pitch propeller has a TBO. There's a
Right.
point at which it has to go in for an overhaul. And the last one I did was for a Cessna 150, and it was about $1,200.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not cheap. And the bigger the aircraft, the more heft of the propeller, the more expensive it is. But man, you do not want to throw a propeller blade. And if there's any question that this is right, you want to get it done. And I mention that because looking through those logbooks, you might find that 1965 airframe just looks great, terrific engine, but that propeller's been on there since 1982.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to have to get work done. And it's not an owner thing. I mean, that's not in the preventative maintenance thing. You're going to have to hire somebody to do that. It actually requires a method. Even getting the propeller back on the way it came off, it's got to be indexed so it goes the same way. It's not for the faint of heart, but that's really self-protection where you're knowing I'm getting a good airplane. And even, what the FAA refers to as accessories pets, starters, generators, alternators, magnetos, they can all have their own airworthiness directives, and many of them are recurring. Magnetos famously, every 500 hours, you've got to do
Mm-hmm.
work on it.
Yep.
Your airplane's down while you're doing that. So knowing what you're getting into through the logbooks is absolutely great.
Yep. I would totally agree with you. So I think we've covered that, Jamie.
I'm going to throw one other thing in because it's worthwhile. And I'm blanking out on the name of the service. So I'll look it up and I'll put it in the titles right down below here. There is a service where you can get the history on your airplane fairly inexpensively and get it delivered on the internet. I mention this because I once owned an airplane that the seller represented as having no damage history. And I looked through the logs and it had no damage history. And I pulled down the report after buying the airplane, and I don't regret buying the airplane. It was terrific. It had been run over by a de Havilland otter in flight in California and trashed. No, there were no fatalities. They got it on the ground, but it went to a junkyard, and I tracked down the original owner. He told me the whole story. then the owner's wife, after it was flying, the guy I bought it from, his wife was flying it, hit a sign and tore the tail off. None of that was in the logbooks, but it was in the report. So it was repaired to airworthy standards. But had I known that, I'd have been able to negotiate that price down because there's an actual record of it. So
Yeah.
doing your due diligence, going through those logbooks, and even hiring somebody to help you read through them and tell you, but what does this mean? Like when the great Pat Brown says, yeah, it's got 300 hours, but that's over 40 years.
Yeah.
That's when sometimes it's worth paying for expertise.
It is worth paying for expertise. That's exactly right.
Pat, I love it. Once again, we have saved people money. We've saved them heartache. We've given them hope. I just feel like we're doing something wonderful for America and the world at large, because I'm pretty sure you can get this video overseas too.
I'll sleep well tonight.
Thanks a lot, buddy. I appreciate it. Folks, put a comment down below if you've ever gone through logbooks and we're just totally befuddled. Let us know if you've got a question. We'll get an answer back to you. Click the like button because Pat loves it when you do, and subscribe because I'm trying to sell subscriptions to put myself through junior college. So I appreciate the effort. And we will see you next time. Thanks.
Adios.